Mike Tyson holds a record that will likely never be broken. On November 22nd, 1986, at the age of 20 years and 4 months, he became the youngest heavyweight champion in boxing history. That record still stands today, nearly 40 years later. No one has come close. And when Mike talks about that night, there's pride in his voice, but there's also sadness, because the one person he wanted to share it with wasn't there to see it. Cus D'Amato, Mike's trainer and father figure, died on November 4th, 1985. He'd spent years grooming Mike to become the youngest heavyweight champion ever. He believed in Mike when no one else did. He built Mike from a troubled kid into a devastating fighter. And he promised Mike they'd make history together, but Cus died a year before Mike won the title. He never saw his prediction come true, and that absence haunted Mike on the night he achieved everything Cus had promised. Today, Mike is 58 years old. He's lived a full life since that November night in 1986. He's won championships, lost championships, gone to prison, made comebacks, and eventually retired. But when people ask him about his greatest achievement, he always comes back to November 12th, 1986. Not because the fight was his toughest, not because Trevor Berbick was his most dangerous opponent, but because that was the night he proved Cus right. That was the night he became the youngest heavyweight champion in history. And that record, unlike everything else in his career, can never be taken away. When Cus D'Amato found Mike Tyson in the Catskills in the early 1980s, he saw something no one else saw. Mike was a troubled 13-year-old kid from Brooklyn with a criminal record and no future. But Cus saw potential, raw power, lightning speed, a fighter's instinct. And most importantly, he saw a boy desperate for a father. Cus became that father. And in return, Mike became Cus's final masterpiece. Cus had trained champions before, Floyd Patterson, Jose Torres. But Mike was different. Mike was the one Cus believed could be the youngest heavyweight champion in history. Floyd Patterson had set the record in 1956 at age 21. Cus wanted Mike to break it, and he structured Mike's entire amateur and early professional career around that goal. Speed, power, pressure, combinations. Everything Cus taught Mike was designed to make him unstoppable by age 20. Mike turned professional in 1985 at age 18. He was dominant from the start. His first 15 fights were all knockouts, most in the first round. Mike wasn't just winning, he was destroying opponents. And Cus was there for all of it, guiding Mike, refining his technique, preparing him for the title shot that was coming. But on November 4th, 1985, Cus died of pneumonia. He was 77 years old. And Mike was devastated. Cus's death broke Mike in ways that took years to fully understand. Mike lost his father figure, his mentor, his protector. But he also lost the one person who believed he was destined for greatness. In the months after Cus died, Mike kept fighting. He had to, not just because it was his job, but because he owed it to Cus. Every knockout was a tribute. Every win was proof that Cus had been right. And when the title shot finally came in November 1986, Mike had one goal: make Cus proud, even if Cus couldn't be there to see it. Trevor Berbick wasn't a legendary champion, but he was a legitimate one. Born in Jamaica, Berbick had been a professional boxer for over a decade by 1986. He'd fought the best: Muhammad Ali, Larry Holmes, John Tate. He'd won some, lost some, but he was always tough and always dangerous. In March 1986, Berbick won the WBC heavyweight title by beating Pinklon Thomas. He was 33 years old, in his prime, and ready to defend his belt. Berbick wasn't fast, he wasn't flashy, but he was big, strong, and experienced. He stood 6'2" and weighed around 218 pounds. He had a decent jab, a solid right hand, and the ability to absorb punishment. He'd never been knocked out in his career. For a young, unproven challenger like Mike Tyson, Berbick was a serious test. The boxing world expected Mike to win, but they didn't expect it to be easy. For Berbick, the Mike Tyson fight was supposed to be a showcase. He'd defend his title against the young phenom, prove he was still elite, and set up bigger paydays down the line. But Berbick underestimated Mike. He saw a 20-year-old kid with a lot of hype. He didn't see the destroyer Cus had built, and that mistake would cost him everything. The build-up to Tyson versus Berbick was relatively quiet. This wasn't a super fight. It was a title shot for a young contender against a champion who'd only held the belt for 8 months. The fight was scheduled for November 22, 1986, at the Las Vegas Hilton. HBO would broadcast it. The odds makers favored Mike, but not overwhelmingly. Berbick was a proven champion. Mike was still unproven at the championship level. Mike trained like a man possessed. He knew this was the moment Cus had prepared him for. His team, Kevin Rooney, Jay Bright, and others, pushed Mike hard. They worked on his speed, his combinations, his defense. They studied Berbick's tendencies. They knew Berbick was tough, but they also knew Mike had the tools to break him down. The goal was simple: become the youngest heavyweight champion in history. Beat Floyd Patterson's record. Make Cus's dream come true. Mike was nervous in the days leading up to the fight, not because he feared Berbick, but because he felt the weight of the moment. This was everything Cus had worked for, everything Mike had worked for. And Cus wasn't there to see it. That absence loomed large, but Mike channeled that grief into focus. He was going to win. Not just for himself, but for Cus. And when he stepped into the ring on November 22, 1986, he was ready to make history. November 22, 1986, Las Vegas Hilton. The atmosphere was electric. Mike Tyson entered the ring wearing black trunks and his signature no-nonsense expression. He was 20 years old, 5'10", 221 pounds of muscle and fury. Trevor Berbick entered wearing red trunks and a confident smile. He was 33 years old, the WBC heavyweight champion. But as the fighters stood face to face, it was clear who looked more dangerous. Mike's eyes were cold. Berbick looked confident, but there was a flicker of uncertainty. The opening bell rang and Mike exploded out of his corner. He didn't waste time. He came straight at Berbick with a relentless attack. Jab, right hand, left hook, jab, right hand. Berbick tried to establish his jab, but Mike was too fast. He slipped Berbick's punches and fired back with combinations that snapped Berbick's head back. Within seconds, it was clear Berbick was in trouble. This wasn't the fight he expected. By the end of round 1, Berbick's face was already swelling. Mike had landed clean power shots. Berbick had barely touched him. The crowd could feel it. This wasn't going to last long. Berbick's corner tried to regroup between rounds, but there was nothing they could tell him that would change what was happening. Mike Tyson was a force of nature, and Berbick was in his path. Round 2 started, and Mike turned up the pressure. He cornered Berbick and unleashed a devastating combination: a left hook to the body, a right uppercut to the chin. Berbick stumbled backward. Then Mike landed another left hook, this one to the head. Berbick went down. It wasn't a clean knockdown. It was awkward, his legs wobbling like he'd lost control of his body. He got up at the count of 4, but he was hurt. The referee, Mills Lane, asked if he could continue. Berbick nodded. Mike moved in for the finish. He landed another combination: right hand, left hook, right hand. Berbick went down again. This time it was worse. He got up, but he was barely standing. His legs were gone. The referee gave him the count and let the fight continue. Mike knew it was over. He moved in one more time and landed a perfect left hook. Berbick went down for the 3rd time, and this time when he tried to get up, his body failed him. He stumbled, fell, rolled, and couldn't find his balance. It was one of the strangest endings to a heavyweight title fight. Berbick was done. Referee Mills Lane waved it off. TKO round 2, the crowd erupted. Mike Tyson, at 20 years and 4 months old, had just become the youngest heavyweight champion in boxing history. He'd destroyed a legitimate champion in less than 2 rounds, he'd broken Floyd Patterson's record, and he'd done it with the kind of dominance that made the boxing world take notice. This wasn't a fluke. This wasn't luck. This was a destroyer announcing his arrival. Mike's corner rushed into the ring. They lifted him up, celebrating. The announcers were calling it historic. But if you looked closely at Mike's face, you could see something else. Tears. Mike was crying. Not tears of joy, but tears of grief. He'd just achieved everything Cus had promised. But Cus wasn't there. And that absence was overwhelming. In interviews later, Mike would admit that the victory felt incomplete without Cus. "I wished he could have seen it," Mike said. "That's all I wanted, for him to be there." The WBC Heavyweight Championship belt was placed around Mike's waist. At 20 years old, he was the youngest man to ever hold that title. And as of today, nearly 40 years later, that record still stands. No one has come close. Mike Tyson's name is permanently etched in the record books. And while his career would have many ups and downs, that November night in 1986 was the beginning of something the boxing world had never seen before. After the fight, the boxing world reacted with a mixture of awe and excitement. Mike Tyson wasn't just a prospect anymore. He was a champion. And he'd won in such dominant fashion that people started asking, is anyone going to be able to stop this kid? The answer, at least for the next few years, was no. Mike would go on to unify the heavyweight titles, destroying everyone in his path. James Smith, Tony Tucker, Larry Holmes, Michael Spinks. Mike became the most feared heavyweight in the world, but the Berbick fight remained special. Not because it was his toughest fight, it wasn't. Not because Berbick was his most dangerous opponent, he wasn't. But because that was the night Mike made history. That was the night he became the youngest heavyweight champion ever. And that was the night he wished, more than anything, that Cus could have been there to see it. Mike's dominance in the late 1980s was unprecedented. He became a global superstar. Pay-per-view king, the face of boxing. But even at the peak of his fame, Mike often talked about Cus. About how Cus had believed in him when no one else did. About how Cus had shaped him into a champion. And about how Cus never got to see the dream come true. That grief never fully went away. It shaped Mike's career and his life in ways that took decades to understand. Mike Tyson is 58 years old now. The youngest heavyweight champion record he set on November 22, 1986, still stands. No one has broken it. And realistically, no one probably will. The sport has changed. Fighters develop slower. The path to a title shot is longer. And the kind of raw, destructive talent Mike had at 20 years old is once-in-a-generation rare. When Mike talks about the Berbick fight today, he does so with pride. "I was 20 years old," he says. "I beat a real champion. I made history." But there's always a hint of sadness when he mentions Cus. "I wish he could have seen it," Mike has said in interviews. "That's the only thing missing from that night. Cus wasn't there." It's a reminder that even in moments of triumph, grief can linger. Mike has made peace with his career. The highs, the lows, the controversies, the comebacks. But the Berbick fight remains untouchable. It's the one moment that can't be diminished by anything that came after. On November 22, 1986, Mike Tyson became the youngest heavyweight champion in history. And that accomplishment, that record, is his forever. November 22, 1986, will always be remembered as the night a 20-year-old kid from Brooklyn shocked the world. Mike Tyson didn't just win the WBC heavyweight title, he destroyed Trevor Berbick in 2 rounds. He broke Floyd Patterson's record, and he became the youngest heavyweight champion in boxing history. Nearly 40 years later, that record still stands. No one has come close to breaking it. But the legacy of that night goes beyond the record. It's about a young man fulfilling a promise. Cus D'Amato had told Mike he would be the youngest champion ever, and even though Cus died a year before it happened, Mike made it come true. That fight was a tribute to Cus, a validation of everything Cus believed, and a reminder that sometimes the people who shape us the most aren't there to see the fruits of their labor. For boxing fans, especially those who watched that fight live, the Berbick fight represents the beginning of an era, the Mike Tyson era. For the next few years, Mike was unstoppable. He dominated the heavyweight division like few fighters ever have. But it all started on November 22, 1986, in Las Vegas against Trevor Berbick. That was the night the youngest champion was born. Here's the final question. Would Mike's career have been different if Cus had lived to see it? Almost certainly, Cus was the one person who could control Mike, who could keep him focused, who could protect him from the vultures that eventually surrounded him. Without Cus, Mike's career spiraled. But on November 22, 1986, none of that mattered. On that night, Mike was exactly who Cus said he would be, the youngest heavyweight champion in history, and nothing that came after can change that.